Where do we begin understanding science? Well, of course, with basic questioning such as, what is science? That's the first and ultimate question. Essentially, everything I'm talking about here has come from that one question. What is science? It seems deceptively simple. It's so taken for granted by us. Because science is just the water we swim in if we were a fish. If you grew up in the 21st century, if you were born in the last 100 years, science is just the water you swim in. And it seems as though science has always been there, and that it's obvious, and that we know what it is. So the first thing I want you to recognize, whether you're a layman or whether even you're a professional or an academic or even a philosopher, you don't know what science is. Please have the enough self-honesty and self-awareness to admit to yourself that you do not know what science is. You don't know. We have to start with that. Because if you think that you know what science is, how can we really question science? You already know. You already have an ideology. You already have a dogma. And you're going to spend the rest of the time defending your pre-existing beliefs. And the reason you don't know what science is because you haven't ever seriously contemplated it. You haven't seriously investigated it. In fact, you've probably never even thought about this question for an hour in your life. You haven't taken it seriously. And the reason why not is because your culture never put that idea in your mind, that it's worthwhile to question what science is. It seems like a waste of time, right? Well, but how would you know unless you actually questioned it? And then the second important question here is, how do you know that science is valid? Seriously, how do you know? You might say, well, Leo, mankind has used science for centuries now and it's produced all this amazing technology, so obviously it's valid. Well, that's an interesting theory, but there's two problems with that. First of all, the problem is that just because you create something successfully, if you manipulate reality, that doesn't guarantee that it's actually valid or true. It just guarantees that you've manipulated reality using some system. We could conceive of many different systems that could manipulate reality. Doesn't make it science, doesn't make it true. So just, again, be careful. There can be a divergence there between truth and manipulation or success. And success produces a very juicy illusion. For example, a lot of people are fooled by celebrities who are very successful, and people think, oh, well, they're so successful, they must have a perfect life. And then, later you realize that, no, this guy is addicted to drugs, he's addicted to sex, and he's depressed, and he ends up committing suicide, and he wasn't happy at all, even though he had money, and he had hot women, and he had everything he wanted, but he was miserable. So, again, success is not happiness. Success is not truth. Success is not science. So just be careful about that. And also the other problem you have here is that, of course, science has historically made a lot of errors and mistakes. So if science was able to make all those errors, how can you be confident there aren't a bunch of errors being made by science right now? I mean, if you've been fooled once, you'd be stupid to assume you can't be fooled twice. So here's what I want you to really, again, using radical self-honesty and self-awareness, I want you to admit the following thing, that you have never validated science as a method. Never. You have not done this. And the reason I can be so sure is because it's actually not possible to do this. You haven't done it. Neither has any scientist ever done it. Neither has mankind as a whole ever done it. And the reason they haven't is because it's impossible. And I will demonstrate to you why that's the case over the next hour. So just stay with me. So let's think about this from scratch, as it were. Where did the scientific method come from? It should be pretty obvious that it wasn't there from the beginning. In the beginning, if you just imagine that you are the first human ever alive, of course, this is sort of a silly, childish thought experiment, but hey, go with me here. Imagine you're the first human ever born. Do you have the scientific method? No, of course not. And how do you get it? Let's assume that you're going to be the first guy to get it. How do you get it? Guy, girl. I'm using it gender neutral here. Let's be politically correct. So how do you get it? Are you going to get it from God? Are you going to go up on a mountaintop and God is going to give you stone tablets etched with the scientific method, the principles and rules for the scientific method? And this is the method God tells you, this is the method that you shall use. Ye shall use this method to distinguish truth from falsehood and discover everything true about nature. Just follow these 10 steps. No, of course not, right? As a scientifically minded person, of course, you don't appeal to things like God giving you the answers. You have to derive the answers from scratch for yourself. And hey, I'm sympathetic to that view, but let's really, really take on that view. Let's really totally assume that we start from a position of ignorance. We know nothing. We know nothing. Now, to start from a total position of ignorance, this is a very radical thing. It's difficult for our mind to even conceive of such a thing and to imagine what that is like because our minds have been programmed by culture from birth with all sorts of ideas, assumptions, technologies, and possibilities for how nature is. We take most of these for granted. We assume they were there from the beginning or that they were obvious. But they weren't obvious. And science wasn't obvious. Some human had to invent science. Which means some human had to decide how to do science. Some human had to sit down and say, this here is valid science, and this here is invalid science. So the question is, how did that first human distinguish between what was valid and what is invalid science? What method did he use? What criteria did he use? How did he do that? How is it possible to do that? Do you see the problem here? If you're going to say, well, he just used science to distinguish between what was valid and invalid. No, you can't do that because that begs the question. Because our question is, how do you know that science is the right way? See, if you say that you can use science to distinguish between truth and falsehood, that already assumes that you validated science and that you know that it's true. But you don't know that. If you say, oh, well, he just used reason and logic to decide what is valid and invalid science. No, that also begs the question. Because the question then is, how do you know what is valid logic and valid reason versus invalid logic and invalid reason? You say, oh, well, it's just evident, self-evident. No, it's not. It's not evident at all. It's only evident to you because you're attached to whatever you're attached to that particular way of doing logic or reason. And that has been all programmed by your culture. You didn't invent that. And there's a further problem. Let's say, you're the first guy to invent your scientific method, but then there's a second guy, the second guy on Earth. And he independently develops his own method. What are the chances that you two are going to have the same method and that you're going to agree? And if you guys disagree, how do we determine who's right? What are you going to say? You're going to say, well, we're just going to use the scientific method to determine who's right. That's begging the question. You're not getting the depth of the problem if you say that. Because the whole problem is that we don't know what the scientific method is, which means that you can't use a scientific method to adjudicate between two different versions of the scientific method. And there's not just going to be two of them, there's going to be hundreds of them, thousands of them. In fact, every human is going to have their own version of a scientific method. Unless somehow we create a culture that corrals people to build a unified method. But even then, there's not one culture in the world. There's many cultures. Cultures have fragments. They have subcultures within them. You're never going to get everybody to agree on your method.